Come gather around, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accepted that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone. For the times, they are a-changing. Come writers and critics who prophesize with your pen, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin, and there's no telling who that is naming. For the loser now will be later to win. For the times, they are changing. Come senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall. For he that gets hurt will be he who is stalled. The battle outside raging will soon shake your windows and rattle your walls. For the times, they are changing. Come mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can lend your hand. For the times, they are changing.
Hello folks, welcome to another episode in the 172nd Fighter Wing YouTube channel. Here's where I do some interesting and hopefully enlightening videos about some of the models in my collection, all of them in 1/72nd scale. Thank you for tuning in, and as I'll say in most videos, please click the like and subscribe button if you like the content I'm putting out. Do keep in mind that if there is something that you feel I should know or that other people should know about the aircraft that we're looking at on these videos, don't hesitate to use the comment section to share your thoughts and perspectives. When it comes to knowledge and informed and understanding, the more the merrier, right? So with that established, let's get to the subject at hand, which is this really well done Air Commander Heavy Metal Series F-4C Phantom II. As some of you may have already picked up, this is the model of the aircraft that was flown by the famous Air Force officer, Brigadier General retired Robin Olds. So going into detail about Robin Olds in this video would be both somewhat off topic and would make this video probably about 4 hours long. So suffice it to say that he is an influential member of the U.S. Air Force, pretty much the embodiment of the ideal fighter pilot. He served in World War II. He didn't go to Korea, as I understand it. He had a staff job at that point, but he did go to Vietnam And his time in Vietnam is where this airplane and the one of the most influential operations early on in the war took place, which is an operation known as Operation Bolo. Now, by the time you watch this video, it will be pretty much the anniversary of the event itself. So it took place in 1967, so we do the math, it's pretty much, it's been some time, let's put it like that. So pretty much on the anniversary of the event itself is when you'll probably be watching this video, and I didn't actually plan it that way. It just turned out that I got this model right before Christmas, and the operation happened January 2nd, 1967. So here we are. It just kind of worked out in terms of it being an anniversary of the event itself. Now, to understand the model, and before we get into talking about like what it is and how good it is and things like that, as some of you have known from my previous videos, I like to talk about the history of these aircraft because there's a story behind these aircraft. There's a human element to airplanes and aviation that sometimes tends to get lost in the mix in some of these kind of discussions about the aircraft. You know, you maybe hear some discussion about the aircraft being X in terms of, you know, Mach number or capability or weapons or influence, maybe even some talking points about history, but you don't hear about the human element. And I think that's the story that really should be told, because I personally feel anyways that when I have a model on display, I'm not just displaying, you know, a depiction of an aircraft and that's it. I mean, the F-4 Phantom, there's thousands of human stories connected to this aircraft, and some of those stories are kind of unexpected, but they deserve attention anyway, and I try to do that justice in my videos. So I'll go into some research and I'll discuss some of the influences that the people had in regards to this aircraft. And, well, to kind of put it in perspective, here's an example of what I mean here. So this is a perfect case of why I go into the history when I talk about model reviews like this. So this little pod right here, that is a QRC 160. This was used to simulate the F-4s being F-105s, because the F-105s would go on these large bombing missions, you see. And when they did so, they would use these QRC pods right here to spoof the North Vietnamese surface-to-air missile systems. Well, the idea behind Operation Bolo was these F-4s were supposed to pretend to be F-105 bombers and therefore confuse the North Vietnamese Air Defense Command. Well, in order to make this ruse happen, the Air Force had to adapt these pods to work on F-4s, which up until the night of Operation Bolo, or the day before Operation Bolo happened, that had never been done before. And the interesting thing about these little pods are, it doesn't seem like it's a big deal. You see that on the model and you think, oh, well, it's just an electronic pod. But let's kind of quantify this here. During the Vietnam War, all of these QRC 160s were being used on F-105s on daily strike missions every day. And there weren't any spares because they were hard to come by. So in order to get these pods to work on the F-4s, the maintenance crews had to basically work all day, normally, getting airplanes prepped and ready for their daily missions into Vietnam. And then when the F-105s came back with their pods, they had to take the pods off of the F-105s and then adapt them overnight, the day before the Operation Bolo was to take place, in order to make them work on the aircraft. Because unlike previous weapon systems like, say, the AIM-9 missile, which will be tested at stateside bases like Tyndall or Edwards is what I was thinking of. But these systems are normally tested and evaluated and written up and documented for like months, if not years, before they go into frontline service. These QRC pods were basically adapted to the F-4C overnight, literally, by maintenance personnel who already worked a full day's worth of work getting the F-105s and the F-4s up and running for their previous day's missions. So there's a human story behind this operation, and it's not something that necessarily would be frontline news on like a history book, right? The history book might say, well, North Vietnamese lost 7 MiGs and the U.S. Air Force didn't have any, didn't have any losses to report. But then you don't hear the story of the poor maintenance guy working, 24-hour shifts because they're trying to hook up a QRC pod on an F-4 so they can do this mission the next day. And it had to be done the next day because once Operation Bolo was over, they had to give the pods back to the F-105 crew so they could use them on the next missions that they were flying. So, I mean, it's such a small thing, but there's a human element to that story. And to kind of put more, get the point across even further, I have a quote here from then Colonel, later Brigadier General is when he retired at, then Colonel Olds, regarding what it was like to fly with these things, because remember, they haven't been tested yet up until the point they were put on these airplanes. So the maintenance people are working overtime to put these things on the airplanes, and Colonel Olds gets on the aircraft, and well, this is what his description is about what it's like to fly one of these things. I quote Colonel Olds: "When discussing the subject of coming into land, or getting ready to take off, Colonel Olds' quote was, 'You just had to come in with full rudder and hope.'" End quote. So, when a veteran of World War II, a fighter ace and all of that, someone who was used to flying difficult, hard to manage airplanes, tells you that you have to boot the rudder in to take the thing off or land and pray and hope, well, I guess that really just shows you how tough it is to fly the thing and what the human story was in terms of all the people that had to work hard to make Bolo happen behind the scenes. And you're not going to hear the story about the maintainer busting his hump 12 hours to get that pod put on the airplane, and you're not going to hear the story about him necessarily taking the thing off because now the pod has to go back to the other squadron so they can fly the F-105 mission the next day. But it's a story that I feel is worth telling, and it's a story that's worth paying tribute to when I'm doing these reviews on these aircraft. So let's take a step back here now that we've covered a little bit of why I do this, and let's look at what Operation Bolo meant. Now, to really talk about Operation Bolo and then to talk about this aircraft's contribution to it, I have to talk about why it matters. And to talk about why it matters, I have to take a step back and begin this interaction, I suppose, with a question. The question is, what happens when two bureaucracies go to war? It's a question that popped up as I was doing research for this video, because as I looked through the source materials about, I looked at the sources from the North Vietnamese perspective, the sources from the U.S. Air Force perspective, and I looked at how each of these organizations approached fighting during Vietnam. It was clear to me that both organizations had kind of a, I wouldn't go so fast to say it's a rigid viewpoint on the war, but they had a bureaucratic mindset. And the surprise was to see that even the North Vietnamese had the bureaucratic mindset going too, which is contrary to some of the things that I've seen in the West about this war, because in the West we have this idea of, the big behemoth U.S. military bureaucracy, and from what I can tell, that image is more or less true to the story. But then you have this idea of the North Vietnamese being these scrappy guerrillas who are just just kind of fighting and maneuvering and not really operating in a traditional organized structure. But especially, at least looking at the North Vietnamese Air Force, that wasn't the case. In the North Vietnamese side of the table, there was definitely some organized leadership and organized ways of thinking in terms of how the war went on. Now, of course, the scale is different, and we'll get into why that's important with regards to Bolo later. But essentially, what we have here in terms of what was going on in 1966 and 1967 was kind of a conflict between two bureaucratic mindsets. You had the bureaucratic mindset of the U.S., which said, in effect, you have these superiority in numbers, superiority in equipment, superiority in people, and they're thinking about this war the same way that America has looked at wars like World War II and Korea, right? The big logistical behemoth, okay? Numbers, numbers, numbers. Tens of thousands of this, 5,000 of that, 800 of this, 28% of this. That's kind of the mindset that's coming into this war. And the mindset of the U.S. at this point, with regards to the MiGs at first, was that it wasn't a big deal. The North Vietnamese didn't have a lot of airplanes. They certainly couldn't stand toe-to-toe with the U.S. military in terms of logistical capability. So the thought process on the U.S. side of the fence in terms of what was going on at the Pentagon and the White House was that the MiGs aren't even a concern. They're not a big deal. I looked at the numbers on that, and something like only 3% of the raids that were being launched at one point during Rolling Thunder were being intercepted and engaged by MiGs. So the mindset of the U.S. military and the U.S. leadership bureaucracy level is MiGs aren't a big deal. They're not an issue. It's the 3% of the sorties are being intercepted, and 3% of the F-105 attacks are being negated. Because to kind of explain that further, if you have an F-105 and it's loaded down with bombs, if a MiG shows up, well, you can't maneuver the airplane with thousands of pounds of bombs attached to your wings and your belly, so you have to jettison all that stuff and then turn around and go back to base because, well, you jettisoned your bombs, so the day is pretty much wasted in terms of being a strike opportunity. So that only happened something like 3% of the sorties that were launched, which meant, as far as McNamara and those guys in the Pentagon were concerned, MiGs weren't a problem. They weren't even. It was a speed bump issue. Now, when you look at that issue from the standpoint of some poor U.S. airman who's been shot out of his airplane and he's bailing out over hostile territory, destined to spend the next 10 years of his life in a North Vietnamese prison, 3%, is it really much comfort to him and his family that, hey, you got shot down and you're being tortured for a decade, but hey, it's only 3% of the overall war effort, so, suck it up, Buttercup. I mean, that's kind of the thinking of the people that have to actually fight this war and the struggles that they faced in actually getting involved in it. That's the human story. And see, again, the history books, they all talk about the numbers and the stats and the big picture, but they don't talk about the poor guy who, gets captured and put in chains and spends the next decade of his life in a, small POW cell. So, initially the U.S. mindset in terms of the leadership thinking around the MiG problem was it wasn't a problem. Now the North Vietnamese, for their side of the table, they had a kind of a different strategy here. The U.S. viewed the MiGs as a nuisance because we could sortie our raids into North Vietnam, bomb the targets that we wanted to bomb, and with the exception of a very small percentage of the raids that we launched, most all of them made it to the target. So in the mindset of the U.S. leadership, they're thinking about air superiority kind of in the same way that you would think about it from like World War II, right? You have airplanes from one country versus airplanes from another country, and the airplanes fight, and then the last airplane still flying means that side has air superiority, right? That's kind of the classic old school thinking around air superiority, and the thought process on the U.S. side was, hey, we have air superiority. The North Vietnamese can't knock us out of the sky, and as long as the U.S. military can send airplanes into North Vietnam to bomb stuff or do things, then we de facto have air superiority because the North Vietnamese can't fight us toe-to-toe. That was their thinking. The North Vietnamese mindset on this subject was a bit different. Their bureaucratic thinking was shaped by people like Mao Zedong, and his principle was asymmetrical warfare, right? Now, we hear that term talked about in Vietnam in terms of land conflict a lot, but it doesn't seem to get much traction in terms of discussing of the air war, and I think it's a bit of an interesting blind spot historically, because to understand the North Vietnamese viewpoint, okay, they understand, right? They can do math too, and they understood, hey, they can't go toe-to-toe with the U.S. military. The U.S. government could lose in a week what the North Vietnamese, have as an entire air force at that point in time. They can't afford to get into a large, square-off duel with the U.S. military. They saw what happened when North Korea tried that, and they got thoroughly mauled during the Korean conflict. So The North Vietnamese realized, hey, they don't have the money, the manpower, the equipment to stand up to the U.S. military toe-to-toe in the air or on the ground. So they go asymmetrical. Now on the ground, you hear the discussion about guerrilla warfare and fighting in the jungle and things like that. But in the air, the guerrilla warfare thinking took a different mindset. Their thought process was the North Vietnamese were only going to sortie their airplanes if they felt they had an advantage, if they felt that it was worth their goal to disrupt whatever strike mission it was. So if there was a target that was in Hanoi that they wanted to protect, then they would scramble the MiGs and send them out after the strike force to disrupt it. Now, when I say disrupt, we should be clear here. The North Vietnamese goal, their leadership, didn't view disrupting the strike as physically destroying every single airplane. They viewed disrupting the strike as getting them to drop their bombs before they got to the target. If the North Vietnamese could convince the strike group to abort their strike and not bomb the target, the North Vietnamese viewed that as a strategic win. So now we have the bureaucracy of the North Vietnamese who feel that disrupting the strike is the goal, and you have the U.S. strategic thinking, which is physically destroying every airplane means air superiority, right? If the North Vietnamese can't shoot down everything, if the North Vietnamese can't stop the U.S. from flying over their territory, then by default the U.S. has air superiority, and case closed, go home, game over, we've done our work for the day. That was their thought process. And here we have an interesting dialogue where one bureaucracy and another bureaucracy are both fighting. They're fighting each other, but they're fighting the war using almost kind of like a strategic mismatch of intent. Because if you look at like Vietnam and their perspective, they view the whole thing as, okay, they had air superiority the whole time. Why? Because they defined air superiority as being able to halt or impact raids when they saw fit, and they could sortie MiGs and convince the strike groups to drop their bombs before they got to the target, which to them meant they had air superiority. And then you have the U.S. side who says, hey, air superiority is, if I send my airplane someplace, can you stop us? And if you can't stop us, then you don't have air superiority. So both sides at this point in the war figure that, hey, strategically they're both cooking with grease, right? But then in 1966, the MiG attacks start getting to a point where the numbers can't be ignored anymore. The leadership in the Pentagon and in the theater commands, people in places like Pacific Air Force's commander, General Mulmeyer of the U.S. Air Force, these people start looking at the numbers and they realized, okay, we're starting to lose more airplanes than we can tolerate. And well, I'll give you a quote here from Old Again. You'll be hearing quotes from him throughout this video, just be aware. And I quote, the MiGs stood to become a real menace. By the end of November of 1966, the MiGs became a factor that we really had to reckon with. This was becoming an impact on our accuracy and our ability to operate, end quote. So the big man himself, Colonel Olds, commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, is making a very simple point, which is that the MiGs are starting to do some damage. The number of airmen that are needing to be rescued and going to POW jail cells is getting a bit unacceptable, even to the Air Force leadership. And now, in 1966, something had to be done. Again, I'll quote Robin Olds once more on the subject of losses. There was a rather black week, he said, where a number of F-105s were lost, and at one of the wings, lost 3 F-105s to MiGs that afternoon. 3. That's 3 crews, end quote, by the way. That's 3 crews that got knocked out of the sky there, okay? 3 pilots, 3 people, and how many, I didn't go into the research to see which of those pilots, who they were, or whether they made it out of the conflict alive, or if they died before being captured, or if they were captured or rescued. But I mean, that's, just picture that, right? I try to think about that for a minute. Like, if you're on a flight going from like Toledo to Virginia or something, and the engine falls off the airplane and you have a rough landing because the engine is missing on the right side of the airplane, it's news, right? It's a big deal, and the people on board are, I suppose, justifiably scared. The pilots, would be commended for having handled the situation pretty well, and that would be, I think, for most people involved, like most people watching this video, will probably find that to be a rather disruptive and scary experience. Now, picture being shot down, right? You get shot down over a country where people don't like you, where you're at war, they're at war with you, and basically everything on the ground wants you dead, right? You get shot down in Vietnam at that point, and you're an American serviceman. There were people who were killed before they even made it to North Vietnamese official custody. I mean, that's not a happy place. It's not exactly the friendly skies we're talking about here. And just trying to picture the mindset of being in that state where, hey, you've been knocked out of the sky, and now the best case scenario is you call for help and you hope that your friends can get a helicopter in and rescue you, knowing full well that they're putting their lives at risk to save yours. So if somebody dies during the rescue attempt, that's another weight on the old conscience. That's one of the better scenarios, right? You get rescued and you get out of there. The worst case scenario is, well, pretty grim stuff. You don't even, make it to going to someplace like the so-called Hanoi Hilton. I mean, you get killed by the militia before you even get there. And if you do get taken into custody by the North Vietnamese, you're looking at that point, almost a decade of being held in prison by a country that, well, they didn't have much interest in negotiating, right? So this is turning into a problem. Okay, these MiGs shooting down these strike missions are now becoming an issue, and something has to be done about that. Now, the original thought that General Mollmeyer proposed to the Pentagon to resolve this situation would seem to be a rather rational countermeasure, which would be just to bomb the MiG airfields to dust. For their own political reasons, McNamara and Johnson declined that option. Now, if you can't bomb the airplanes on the ground, the stated reason being that they were concerned that China or Russia would get involved if that happened, fears which would later prove to be unfounded in later campaigns, it must be said. So if you can't bomb the MiGs on the ground, that leaves literally one option, and you have to deal with them in the air. And this was going to require some planning and some very intricate thinking because, well, ideally you don't want to take on airplanes in the sky. It's a bit paradoxical, but strategically speaking, the best place to kill an airplane is when it's on the ground. That's why the Israelis put so much stock and trade into bombing Arab airfields before war started, because the best way to kill an air force is while it's on the ground, vulnerable and waiting to do something, right? When it's not going anywhere. So now when you deal with the prospect of having to fight them in the air, that changes the dynamic already, right? So now we look at why Operation Bolo was put into place. So in late 1966, the planning stages for Operation Bolo were kicked off. And we should start off here by mentioning that Bolo was a gamble. It was a big one. It was a big gamble. Because remember, we're not dealing with a traditional air-to-air engagement here. This is not massive country A fighting the combined air forces or air force of country B. This is different from those kind of set-piece wars where it's Air Force versus Air Force. You have a big, large U.S. military presence going up against a really comparatively tiny Vietnamese Air Force setup, and the Vietnamese are choosy about what they engage and what they don't. And to do Operation Bolo correctly, they're going to need a lot of assets. I already mentioned how the targeting pods right here have to be reconfigured literally overnight before the mission starts, the day before, to get them off of the F-105s when they land in the evening, turn and burn on wrenches all evening to get them bolted onto the F-4 so that morning they'd be ready to go for Operation Bolo. I mean, that's a pretty majorly disruptive event right there in terms of squadron planning and logistics, right? But well, let's just chart through this here. So let's look at what actually went through in terms of Operation Bolo. Obviously, the F-4s were the ones that did the shooting, but there's a lot of other airplanes behind the scenes that were in place. So we had 32 F-4Cs, one of which was the ride that Colonel Olds flew in. So you have 32 F-4Cs. You also had 4 F-104 starfighters, and this is something a lot of aviation geeks might not realize. The F-104s flew top cover for Operation Bolo to ensure that the North Vietnamese couldn't surprise the surprisers, right? So you have to be thinking one step ahead on things like this, and then 20 F-105s to help with the feint side of things. That doesn't include, by the way, the number of KC-135 tankers that have to be moved and placed into position to fuel all these airplanes to make this operation happen. So then you have the call signs, then you have the paperwork, then you have the flight documentation, then you have all the stuff that happens on the ground to get these airplanes ready to go in doing this mission. It's a lot of resources, a lot of manpower, a lot of equipment, a lot of direction, a lot of moving parts here. And they're doing all of this in the hope, fingers crossed, that the North Vietnamese will buy the electronic ruse and assume that these F-4s are considered F-105s. So to really kind of understand how big of a Hail Mary gamble this operation was, not only are we, the U.S. military scrambling a lot of resources to make this operation happen, there's no guarantee the Vietnamese will even show up. And this is something that Colonel Olds points out in his book, Fighter Pilot, which I do recommend you pick up too, even if you're not necessarily interested in aviation models. It's just a great read, even if you're not necessarily a fighter pilot. It's so good you'll feel like a fighter pilot when you're done reading it. That's how good it is. But coming back to the subject at hand, Colonel Olds in that book actually recognized, hey, there's a non-zero possibility this could be one big goose egg. And it would have destroyed his career if it had been. If he had made all these arrangements, got all these assets in place, moved all these aircraft and people and personnel and equipment around, moved the better part of multiple military bases worth of hardware to coordinate on an operation, and then the MiGs didn't show up, I mean, that would have been, it would have basically torpedoed any political support Olds ever would have had again. It would have ended his career, which wasn't necessarily a thing that he was worried about at that point. I'll come back to that later in regards to this, but his concern was for his men, because he figured, hey, if this didn't work out and the MiGs didn't show up, or worse, which was an unlikely but potential possibility, maybe the North Vietnamese trapped them, right? Maybe there's the North Vietnamese compromise the operation. Instead of the U.S. Air Force trapping them, they send more airplanes up and trap the Air Force shooters because, hey, they figure out in advance what the operation is, and then it turns into a disaster, right? If it goes bad or it doesn't happen at all, Colonel Olds, leader of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, might not be at that job anymore. And his concern was, his men needed leadership. They needed somebody who had been to war and understood some of the things that needed to happen to survive it. And if Olds was reassigned to a desk job and punishment, his men would be left in command by somebody who might not understand or care about their survival. So his mindset was, okay, this operation obviously had to work because you need to make a difference in the war and all those things, but he was concerned about the human element as well. The idea of, okay, well, if he gets reassigned or demoted or booted out of his command because this operation fails, what happens to his men who are led by what he would call like a shoe clerk, one of these types of officers that has the statistics memorized but can't fight their way out of a wet paper bag. His fear was, hey, the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing is going to be led by some paper pushing guy better suited with the DMV, and then his men are doomed, right? So there's a lot riding on this. And at the time, all the way up to the point where the F-4s take off, there was still some doubts about whether or not the MiGs would even show up. And up until the time when the MiGs came through the clouds, it was a nail-biting thing. Even Olds himself had said when he was flying over the overcast, once he got above the clouds, he thought, well, this was going to be a total goose egg because the weather's socked in, and even if they thought that they were F-105s, they're not going to send a strike package up to take them down through the clouds. That was the thinking that he had, all the way up until the first MiG popped up behind him. And Olds actually does do a play-by-play review of the Operation Bolo dogfight from his perspective as the guy leading the formation. He does talk about how at one point a MiG actually popped up right behind him, which it's an interesting thing to read because I read about it in obviously his memoirs, Fighter Pilot, and then I read one of the source materials for this video is a book by, I'm sorry, I'm going to murder his name, and I apologize in advance, Istzack Toperczer, I believe, on MiG-21 Aces of the Vietnam War. And there's an account from one of the Vietnamese pilots who, if I'm reading it right, might actually have been the pilot behind Olds when Olds was the head of the formation, and the Vietnamese MiG pilot popped up through the clouds. When he popped up through the clouds, he saw the F-4s, and the aircraft he might have been looking at could have been the Oldses themselves. And we'll get into some more information about that a little bit later in the video. But I just think it's just cool to see the same story written by two men who may have faced each other down in combat, and just to see that same event from two different perspectives. It's a unique gift of modern records and being able to do that. I mean, how many accounts do we see of some guy in the Spartan army fighting the Persians thousands of years ago at Thermopylae? We don't have an account from the Spartan guy who gets killed about what it was like to fight that army, nor do we have one from the Persian who faced off against him too, right? So, good times we live in. I thought that was kind of a fascinating thing to look at, the same event through two different eyes, if you will. So, as many of you aviation fans are aware of, Operation Bolo turned out to be a resounding success. The North Vietnamese they accepted the information they had and thought that they were dealing with F-105s. They weren't. And they lost. This is disputed, apparently. I looked at my sources on this. The U.S. military stands by the statement of 7 MiGs being shot down. The North Vietnamese claim 5. So the source material differs on that. Just bear that in mind as you if you do your own lookup and research into this. But the agreed point is none of the U.S. aircraft took a loss at all in this operation. Now, scrambling 57 aircraft plus support aircraft to take down between 5 and 7 airplanes would seem to be a lot of effort. But the key impact on this is not necessarily just the fact that they shot down, between 5 and 7 MiGs, which, I mean, that's a pretty big accomplishment in and of itself in a war where you had almost equal levels of parity between the U.S. and the North Vietnamese Air Force side of things. But the real impact of this, I believe, is being able to see what happens when the mindset of one group of fighters runs head-on into the unpredictable decisions of someone else. Because for most of the war, it was the North Vietnamese that were doing things that were unconventional and incomprehensible to the Air Force and the U.S. military bureaucracy, right? The military bureaucracy of World War II, the military bureaucracy of North Korea. It's a big, lumbering, fixed mental image giant, and changing things in war is not something that this mental bureaucratic culture is really equipped to deal with. I'll take a small diversion to talk about something else that reinforces this point. With the F-4s during Vietnam, they flew them in what was called the Fluid 4. And it was a formation that came from World War II, where you had one guy at the beginning of the formation who did the shooting, and the other 3 aircraft existed to cover each other so that the guy at the front who was doing the shooting didn't get jumped by another aircraft. It made sense during World War II to do that. It made sense to some extent during Korea to do that when the fighters all had guns. But once missiles came into the picture in Vietnam and you had more advanced communication and technology and aircraft, it didn't. But the Air Force didn't really recognize that. You had people at the tactical level, at like Colonel Olds' level, who were saying, hey, this Fluid 4 thing ain't working, we're going to do mutual pairs. And at one point, I believe, Olds, on his own initiative, changed the formation because he understood, hey, look at the data, this isn't working. But the big Air Force, they even after the war, even after Vietnam ended, they were still intransigent about the idea of switching away from the fluid fixed 4 aircraft formation because that was the way things had been done since the 1940s. So we're looking at a bureaucracy that's used to thinking of things a certain way. And the North Vietnamese bureaucracy, because it's new, because the Air Force had to be created brand new out of whole cloth, I think one North Vietnamese pilot even said he went from the bicycle to the MiG-17, because that was what it was like setting up an Air Force in a country like Vietnam that didn't even have a paved road system yet when the war happened with America. So you have a situation in the North Vietnamese where they're like a brand new startup. They're starting this whole operation, this whole Air Force thing completely from scratch, which means they're able to think about how to fight and how to move and how to operate as a bureaucracy in a lot more, we would look at it in a modern business sense as being lean, right? They can think about it from a leaner, meaner, more practical perspective because they're brand new. They were a brand new startup in the business of war, if you think of it that way. And the U.S. Air Force and U.S. military is kind of that old, traditional, blue chip, IBM, General Motors, corporate kind of, press this button and push that lever and do that. Well, why do we press that button and push that lever, someone might ask? Well, we've always done it that way. That's usually the answer, right? So up until this point in the war, with Operation Bolo, it's been the North Vietnamese that have been changing the game and dictating the strategic interaction between these bureaucracies. But Bolo marked a change in this. It marked a change in how, okay, now it was the U.S.'s turn to redefine how the fighting would happen. And to quantify that impact, to show what effect it had on the North Vietnamese side, I have a passage from one of the pilots, and again, I have to convey my disclaimer here. I don't know how to speak Vietnamese, so if I botch this poor man's name, I do apologize in advance. So here's a passage, a quote from ADF VPAF pilot Phu Ngoc Dinh, and he was one of the aviators who was shot down during the Operation Bolo setup. Begin quote here. "We were completely stunned. Our command didn't realize what was happening. They jammed, they being the Americans, jammed everywhere they appeared, which made the sky dark so we could not see anything on radar. When we came out of the cloud," meaning he's coming out of the cloud deck, which hides any visual understanding of what he's looking at there. "We came out of the cloud," he said. "We encountered F-4 Phantoms. They were waiting for us. 5 of us were shot down. And I was angry and upset. The next day, when I was lying in the hospital, our commander Phu Thai visited and said it was our mistake, and then he left. The fact that a commander admitted his mistake to us made us respect and believe him." End quote. So now we have a turning of the tables. And I don't just mean in terms of the kill ratios or the number of airplanes being shot down or the strategic impact of strike formations or any of those kind of things. The mental and psychological impact of dictating what happens in this war, the initiative has been changed by this. And the initiative and the mental shock of something like this, of being surprised, Airman Ngoc Dinh just outlined it pretty clearly right there. And that's something that's very, very difficult to put down on paper and say, this is the numeric impact of a psychological change in a war. It almost is like shades of the Doolittle raid, in that the Doolittle raid, if you look at it from a numbers and sense perspective, at best it's all wash, right? We sent B-25s to bomb Tokyo. We did light damage to their city in some respects. In exchange, we put 2 of our fleet carriers at risk and lost a fleet of aircraft in the process. And, this is another piece that I didn't realize until later, there were some Chinese reprisals that the Japanese did on the Chinese mainland because the Chinese helped us at that point run that operation to recover the aircraft and the crew. So, we're talking about a lot of resources and people going into something that on paper, in a military sense, didn't necessarily accomplish a lot. But the accomplishment of that mission, the win of it, was not the stuff that you can measure with rulers and spreadsheets and calculators. It was the psychological initiative of the war and the thought process of, hey, you know, the other side has a vote in this too. And there was a quote that I will use here with regards to war that I think captures the point. You can plan whatever you want, but the enemy always has a vote. And the North Vietnamese got a reminder that as big and square and bulky and huge and inflexible that the U.S. military might be, it still has a vote in this fight. So Bolo changes the psychological status quo of this war, and the shock of losing all these aircraft in the fighting, it's so tactically destabilizing that the North Vietnamese military literally just pulls out of operations. They stop flying operations and intercepts for about 4 or 5 months. And the idea here was the North Vietnamese looked down and realized, hey, they missed something in this, and it was time to reevaluate their way of doing business. And when I looked at the source material for this video from MiG-21 Aces of the Vietnam War, it's from Topercerz's book, it's actually more to it than just Bolo. Bolo, from what I can tell, was like the straw that broke the camel's back. There had been some issues that the North Vietnamese military had been dealing with in their pilots for months, up until Bolo happened throughout 1966. There were apparently issues with pilots getting undisciplined and cocky, and you know, you have to remember, of course, they started this whole thing up from scratch, mind you. So you've got a lot of egos going on here. You've got some aces walking around too that have shot down some F-105s over the previous 12 plus months. So you've got some people in this military, the North Vietnamese Air Force, that are kind of, they're feeling their oats, as it were. They got some spurs, and they got some kill marks and some medals, and they're feeling pretty confident, and that tends to breed issues, right? Pilots weren't apparently following orders. The ground control interceptors would try to get them to do something, and the pilots would either delay in complying or just behave undisciplined. And apparently there were issues with tactics, because up until Bolo happened, they were flying predominantly MiG-17s and MiG-19s. The MiG-21s at that point were a brand new airplane for the Vietnamese military. So they were using MiG-17 and MiG-19 tactics, using the MiG-21, which is a very different airplane. And when they lost all those aircraft over Operation Bolo, that was a sign on behalf of the North Vietnamese military and their bureaucracy that, hey, it was time to hit the pause button and reset their entire way of doing business, get their house in order, so to speak. So it looks like Bolo by itself didn't trigger that massive review, but when that happened, I should say, Bolo was the last element that made the Vietnamese leadership go, hey, wait a minute, we have to redo what we're doing here. So that's one thing that I think is worth pointing out here too, that the North Vietnamese were a lot more willing to listen when things needed to change. It seemed like the bureaucracy of the U.S. military kind of had this mindset of, well, we've always put the square widget in that bucket, and that's what we're going to keep doing, whether it kills people or not. I mean, it's like a very rigid thing. And as a veteran of a far, far, far later than this time frame, I can say that mindset is still, unfortunately, very much alive and well in the modern military. But it's getting a little off topic here. So the Bolo changed the initiative, and it changed it in a positive way for the U.S. forces. But the unfortunate thing about Bolo is that the military was just too inflexible in thinking to capitalize on it. For the first few months of 1967, after all these losses on January 2nd, the North Vietnamese military pulled back. But after 4 months or so of reviewing their information in the spring, the North Vietnamese come back. And when they come back, they've got a whole different set of tactics and rules and ideas on how to go about their fighting. They're taking the Phantom's capability of vertical maneuvering into account now, so they don't do turn fights, they do wagon wheels for defensive maneuvering. So if you try to go into the wagon wheel of airplanes, the airplanes all fly in a big circle. And if someone tries to go into the circle and shoot one of the North Vietnamese airplanes, his wingman that's behind on the circle will just turn and shoot the attacking aircraft. So this is a different formation. It now needs to be countered and evaluated, and the North Vietnamese go back to more aggressive pursuits using ground control intercept to hit more targets, and the North Vietnamese start using more dynamic approaches to vector fighters to attack, and the U.S. military doesn't change anything. This is something that Colonel Olds is very vocal about in his memoirs as well. Again, this one of the hardest parts about doing this video was there was so much material and so much of it so good that I could probably keep talking about Bolo and how all that impacted things for like 5 hours straight. I mean, there's just a lot, and I highly recommend that if you're interested in this subject to pick up the source material, look at his book, Fighter Pilot, to get a real gritty look at what some of the behind-the-scenes stuff around Bolo and the mindset of the Air Force and the bureaucracy of the higher military was at this point in the Vietnam War, just to kind of illustrate how out of touch some of these people were. They were still flying F-4s on combat air patrol, meaning you have your bombers doing the bombing, and then you have airplanes that are supposed to be used as CAP or combat air patrol, and their job is to shoot down any MiGs that show up. But the generals are demanding that the combat air patrol, these airplanes that are supposed to be used for fighting MiGs, are carrying bombs. So the bureaucracy is insisting that every airplane in the formation, even the ones that are supposed to fight other airplanes to protect the bombers, carry bombs and act as bombers themselves. So that mindset is still very much in play throughout 1967, and the losses pick right back where they left off. And once again, the mindset of the military is, hey, we have the equipment, we have the people, we have the air superiority. Why is this a problem? It's almost like that mindset I once heard from someone I knew in college who worked at a big telecommunications company, and I'm not going to mention who it is because honestly probably all of them think the same way, but she used to work at this big telecommunications company, and at one point a customer had a complaint about something or other and threatened to take their business away if it wasn't resolved. And she brought that to her boss, and her boss just shrugged and said, hey, we're a big telecom company. We get 10,000 new customers every day. We don't care about this guy, right? I feel like that's kind of the mindset going on here, meaning, hey, we've got, we have thousands and thousands of people, billions of dollars in resources and manpower and equipment. If we lose, 15 F-105s in a month, oh, well. I mean, as callous as that sounds, that's the bureaucratic mindset of a lot of people, unfortunately. And again, as a veteran of a far more recent military setup, I can vouch for the fact that that mindset is still very much alive in many quarters of the headquarters, Air Force and higher up thinking even today. So, now, finally, I'm sure some of you have been like, oh, you've been talking about all this stuff. Can we get to the model? Yeah, darn straight. So let's get to it. Let's talk about the F-4C in question. Now, this is obviously of the serial that Colonel Olds himself flew into combat. And on the other side, it has the MiG painting markings, so you can probably see in some of the earlier footage. It's also got the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, the Devil logo on the side, which I believe is still being used today. If I understand it right, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I believe at this point in January 2021, the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing is assigned out of Korea, and I think they fly F-16s now. The Air Force, being the Air Force, I seriously doubt they allow them to have any kind of cool insignia like that one on the nose, but I believe they still have that as their squadron color and mascot at this point, even now. So anyways, this is of that aircraft, and I dare say it is actually a really good aircraft, really good model. I heard about the canopy. Apparently this was an issue on some of their earlier releases for Air Commander. I didn't have any trouble with it. You can open either of the back or the front ones and show it open or show it closed. They do give you 2 pilots as well. I don't. I like showing my airplanes like they're basically parked for most of the time. So the only place I would display them is at work, but I don't want to do that either because apparently the cleaning staff there like a habit of breaking things. So Most of them stay here, and then I keep them closed with the pilots out. But you can open them up. You can open these up and show the pilots in there if you want to. In the kit, you do get 4 AIM-7 Sparrows. You get the pylons here. So that pylon, you can accommodate either 2 AIM-9 Bs, I believe, or you can put a pylon here, and it'll have 3 bombs. So you have a triple ejector rack. You have 1 bomb here, 1 bomb here, 1 bomb on the bottom. Because Olds actually did do a really daring. I'm going to say this as an aside here, but Colonel Olds did have a very daring raid that he ran with the F-4s involving an air-to-ground op against the bridge, and at one point he led his flight at like 50 feet in fog in North Vietnam over karst to bomb this bridge. And honestly, he talks about that in his book in Fighter Pilot, and frankly I think it's a much more much more engrossing and emotionally frightening / interesting / amazing story than Operation Bolo and his dogfight there. And I know that's saying something, but you have to read it to know just how crazy it was. I mean, he was flying below the height of telephone poles around mountains in the fog, and yeah, that was a pretty crazy raid. So you can show this airplane in an air-to-ground configuration with those bombs and a center tank if you so desire. And if you want to commemorate that mission, go for it, because I saw that story in the book and was like, wow, that's... And I think most people that haven't read the book probably don't even know it, but it's crazy. And that air-to-ground raid was something amazing. It was so crazy, I think even the Air Force gave him a Distinguished Flying Cross for that mission because of how insane it was. So anyways, coming back to the aircraft itself here, you get displayable with the gear down or up. You can put the gear down, or you can show it with the gear up, and if you are so inclined. It has inserts to do that. The landing gear, actually in the back, the main gear in the back over there, it is one solid plastic piece that you put underneath it, versus Hobby Master, where it's like 2 separate pieces that fit into slots in the bottom of the aircraft. So way more stable than the Hobby Master one, so that's a big thumbs up there. So the small panel lines, like the paneling and the labels, I mean, it is amazing how Air Commander has done a really good job of showing all of the markings and all that stuff. Hobby Master does a pretty good job with their F-4s too, don't get me wrong. But Air Commander has really knocked it out of the park with labels like the radar label right here. So you have the radar label right there. You also have the little label right here for the warning and all that stuff. Even all the little panels, it's really well done. So the engine detail is really good as well, especially the GE J79 pedals. That's well done. The refueling port is labeled. I mean, it's great. They've done a really good job of making the markings noticeable, but not so obtrusive that it overrides or detracts from enjoying the model overall. So Air Commander, I think, has done a really good job of showing this, and yeah. So in terms of positives, I think it's a really well done model. Now for the downsides, the biggest downsides of this model, frankly, are going to be availability, because as I make this video now, the model's been out since December 2020. I added myself to the email subscription list at my retailer to get this. Once I got the email, I bought it right away. It is now January of 2021, and it's almost sold out right now at that retailer. So because of Colonel Olds and because of how well known he is in the aviation community, anything that's attached to his legacy is going to be a pretty hot seller. So hopefully when you watch this, you can still get them at a reasonable price. But if you're watching this in like the year 2025, good luck. Because right now I think Hobby Master released one of this aircraft in their own series, I think like 2 or 3 years ago or whatever. And I saw one on eBay for like $270 right now. So right now the retail on these guys is about $150 at retail. But again, I'm not too sure you'll be able to get these when you watch this video. Most of the other models that I have are relatively not famous, so you can still get like an F-14 or a, you know, F-111 or one of those types of models, and it's not going to kill your wallet too much. But so anything with Colonel Olds' name on it, it's going to be expensive if you wait. So downside is going to be availability big time, especially if you are trying to get this and it's been like months or years after the release. Be prepared to open your wallet. That's kind of the downside I'm going to say right here about that. It also means if you have any interest in buying this and they are in stock at like a retailer or whatever, get it. Just buy it. Even if you're like, you know, I'm on the fence and I'm not really sure if I like F4s, get it. Because if you don't like it and you want to sell it later, rest assured you will get your money back. So the other thing in terms of the downside of the model is some of the kit is going to be hard to fit. The Q160 pod, I had to use a little bit of force to put that in, but it did fit. The pylons, actually one of the missiles was crooked. You might have noticed that in some of the close-up footage I did before the historical section of the video. One of the missiles on one of the pylons, I think on the left side of the aircraft, meaning the other side as you see it here, one of them was crooked. I had to actually go and fix that because I actually didn't pay attention to that until I looked at the footage and was like, wow, that's actually not straight, and then went about fixing that. So it's done now. It looks good, okay, or at this point, but it was crooked, a little odd, but I mean, it's an AIM-9B. So in the scheme of things, it's not a major deal. And the the AIM-7 Sparrows, meant to say, they don't have like a little tab that fits into a spot in the fuselage like the QX60 or QR160 pods here. They're cut so that the fins just fit into the fuselage, which means they're a bit tight. It's almost weird because you almost have to like push it in with enough force that you're afraid that you're going to break something, but not so much force that you actually break something. So it's a little tricky. You might have to do some minor filing on the missile to get it to fit. I didn't have to do that, but it was a really tight fit. So some of the pylons are a bit fussy. The pylons for the missiles here, for the AIM-9s, if you just look at them wrong, they'll just fall off the airplane. So might need to put some like white glue on that when you put it together if you want to show it with the missiles on. It's kind of the same dynamic with the bombs. One side the bombs fit in just fine, the other it's a little loose. So the pylons are kind of a tricky thing with this airplane. Fuel pylons go on just fine. These guys are perfectly okay. The landing gear fits in just fine. It's just the AIM-7s and the AIM-9 pylons that are just weird. And to be fair to Air Commander here, the Hobbymaster F4s have similar issues with their accessory attachment on the F4s. I'm not sure why the F4 is so hard to do this with, but I don't know. I don't build, I build models sometimes, but they're like the Revel things when I can't buy them in diecast. So maybe it's just a tolerance thing with the mold. I'm not sure, but it seems like with some of the diecast F4s, pylon fit and accessory fit is just going to be one of those things. It's just going to be an issue no matter where you buy it from or who you get it through. So in terms of downsides, I mean, it's not a big deal, but I do mention it so that people aren't breaking their accessories because they're like, why isn't this fitting into the slot? I'm just saying right now, you might have to do some like white gluing or some sanding to get this all to work if yours has particularly tight tolerances. So yeah, those are the only flaws I would look at as being major in terms of impacting ownership experience. And I'll wrap this up by saying that if you really are a fan of Robin Olds, or even if you're just somebody who's a fan of F4s, I would definitely recommend buying this. And if you're curious about the man and his legacy, do check out his memoirs, Fighter Pilot. It's a really good book, even if you're not necessarily a fan of airplanes, which if you're not, kind of interested in why you're watching this video. But thank you anyway, I guess. So as far as a buy recommendation, definitely get it. The accessories for the missiles and the belly stuff, like the ECM pod and the AIM-7s, might be a little fussy. Just bear that in mind when you're putting it together and opening the box. But other than those minor issues, it is a really good model, really excellent, nicely done. Great job by Air Commander to pay homage to something that is really cool. One of these days, I'm going to go to the Air Force Museum in Ohio. Unfortunately, right now, it's not a good time to be going much of any kind of tourist destination at the moment. But once that situation is resolved, I'll take a trip down to Ohio and take a look at the actual airplane one-on-one. So one of these days, plan on doing that. Speaking of future planning, I'll offer some tidbits on what my next video plans are. Might be opening a can of worms doing this, but I feel as the viewers, you should know what I've got planned. So I have a lot more on the list of videos I want to do. So I have a Jaguar SCAT GR1 I'm looking to probably do a video on pretty soon. After that, I'll do the Tornado GR3. Those are both Corgi releases, and I'll probably put together a good video out there for the people across the pond. Show some love there. Next on the list onto that is the MiG-23 Flogger. I do have a MiG-23, but I want to wait until I get another one that's a little bit differently configured so I can do justice to the video. I also have to do some additional research because the MiG-23, that's a weird airplane to research. From what I can tell from the source materials, it's going to be weird. It's going to be a tough video to do because there's a lot of conflicting information I have to parse through to get that one done right. So MiG-23 Flogger, that'll be on the list. F-100D, that's on the list too. That one should be pretty not really straightforward, but I haven't started the research on that one yet, so we'll see. Might find some sorted, interesting information on the F-100 too, and then that might be an interesting dialogue. It's one of the things, I'm just going to take this moment here and mention, it's one of the things I enjoy doing these videos for, because the traditional thought is that I just do these videos and I'm the one teaching the viewer something, but when I do these videos, I learn stuff. I learn stuff about airplanes I didn't even think was a thing, like the QR pods and how these interacted with Operation Bolo and how the whole thing hinged on it. I had no idea about that until I started researching this, and I thought I knew a lot about Bolo because of reading Rob Knowles' memoirs. So when I do these videos and I do the source material research on it, I learn new things, and I'm excited to share that with you guys. So I look at these videos and I look at the aircraft and I think, oh, that'll be a quick one. That shouldn't be too hard. F4, Robin Holds, oh, this will be quick. I already have the book, in fact. This should be real easy. And yeah, no, I did do some digging, and especially in the North Vietnamese side of things, and holy crap, just amazing information to review and to know, and the human stories to tell, as it were. So I think the F-100D should be a relatively straightforward story, but we'll see. I've been surprised before. You got the F-101 Voodoo. That one I'm looking forward to doing. Not that I'm not looking forward to the rest of the ones I mentioned, but the Voodoo I definitely want to do because that aircraft is criminally underrated. I mean, there are people who know about the F-4 and they have no idea the Voodoo even exists, which to me is crazy because without the F-101 Voodoo, you don't get the F-4 Phantom. And it's pretty much that simple if you want to draw a linear comparison. The Voodoo story is also going to be one of those tough ones to tell because that airplane had a very interesting service life in 3 different iterations, and telling that story is going to be like telling a Christopher Nolan plot. A lot of stuff happening at the same time in different time frames and different aircraft and different theaters. Yeah, that's going to be a good one to do, and I'm looking forward to it because we need some more love for that F-101 Voodoo. That aircraft did a lot of... It did a lot, let's put it like that. And there's even some tangential history of the F-101 and Colonel Olds too, and the Voodoo is actually the reason why he wound up in Vietnam to begin with by his own design. There's a story around that too, and I'll save it for the Voodoo video, but yeah, that's an airplane that definitely needs some more love in the world, I believe. That's just my thought. Next on the list, the F-14 Persian Tomcat. Oh boy, that video I'm gonna do. I know some of you have seen that little suspiciously camouflaged F-14 over there. Maybe you've seen it in the background in some of my other videos. I will be doing a Persian Tomcat video at some point, and it's going to be a doozy. I tried to do it like last month, and wow. Just to put it in perspective, I came across an article about corruption between Grumman bribing people and agents of the Iranian Shah's government to get the F-14 purchased by them, and that's just one of the source materials that I've been looking at on that one, and it's going to be a doozy. That's going to be a video. That might be my first two-parter, honestly, because dealing with the F-14 in Iranian service is like telling a weird cross between Top Gun and a Jason Bourne movie. It's just spy stuff and skullduggery and tales of international intrigue and woe. And every time I try to think of a way to just tell a story about the F-14 without the human element of all that, it's just impossible. I've tried to conceive of it, and it's just not working. So that video is on the list. And further down the line after those, I have plans to look at the A-10, the F-16, and the Sukhoi Su-24. Hopefully I might be able to get the Su-22 in there before the end of the year. We'll see how that goes. Yeah, so those are the plans I have for 2021 to get some additional videos and content on the channel. And if you guys have any suggestions on videos I should do and models I should review and that I actually already have, which will be hard for you to know, of course, unless you ask. So please do. Put your comments in the appointed space below. And I welcome your feedback about how I'm doing and what I'm up to on these videos. And I will leave it at that. Thank you for watching. Thanks for your time and attention. And have a good day and have a good year.